Welcome to Billings Estate National Historic Site. We're located at 2100 Cabot Street in the Alta Vista neighborhood. You may be familiar with the Billings Bridge Plaza, which takes its name from the area that was built by the Billings family. Billings Estate was established in 1812 when Bradish Billings settled on an empty patch of land. Bradish Billings settled here in 1812 when he was looking for virgin forests that he could lumber in order to establish his wealth. He'd lost his fortune 2 years earlier when a lumber raft was destroyed during a storm on the St. Lawrence River. In order to repay his debt, he wanted to find an unforested area where he could work the land with his own crew. He settled here on the shores of the Rideau River in 1812. And within a few years, he had established a large lumbering operation as well as an agricultural operation. When he first settled here, he lived in a shanty on the shores of the Rideau River. But a year later, after marrying Lamira Dow, who he met in Merrickville, he built a small frame house, and 2 years later, they welcomed their first daughter, Sabra Billings. Bradish was a hard-working individual. After entering the lumber trade, he also worked his fields for farming, but he saw lots of opportunities. He built a sawmill so that he could turn his raw logs into lumber. And when he heard about the construction of the Rideau Canal in 1826, he quickly established some contracts to supply both wood and food to the growing city of Bytown. Shortly after that, he was able to leave the lumber business altogether and focus more on agriculture. He was also, at that point, started to build the community of Billings Bridge surrounding his property. In 1828, he started the construction of the house that sits here today and acts as a museum. As the community grew around him, Bradish saw lots of opportunities to expand his influence. He was integral in forming the town government. He took petitions to fund the first bridge that spanned the Rideau River over what is now Bank Street. Of course, Billings Bridge takes the name of Bradish Billings, and due to the work that he contributed here. Bradish wasn't the only hard worker in his family, though. His wife, Lamira, who had been a school teacher prior to their marriage, was also a strong contributor to the community. She continued to teach children when they first settled and sponsored the first school in the community. She raised her children to be hardworking as well. In total, they had 9 children, 7 of whom survived past their first year. They were all well-educated children who contribute to their communities. When Bradish passed away in 1864, he decided to leave the house to his 2 daughters. He knew that they were the ones who would be most likely to continue the legacy that he had started here. And they did. They turned the farm into a very productive dairy, one that they employed many women in the community, but also worked in themselves. At one point in the 1860s, they were one of the largest dairies in Eastern Ontario, producing over 60,000 pounds of butter and cheese annually. One of the unique things about them is that they both inherited the house, but they divided it, and each of them lived on their own side. And neither of them married over the course of their lives, and they both lived to be over 90 years old. Sally tended to be more of a homebody, and she took great care of the family business. Sabra did the same for a year, but she was very well educated and fond of traveling, and so by her midlife, she decided to travel quite extensively. She spent many of her winters in Brooklyn and later spent her time primarily in Brockville, but would always return to the family estate. Since neither of them had any children, when it came time to pass the house down to the next owners, they settled on their nephew, Charles Murray Billings. Charles Murray was the son of their brother, Charles, and he had taken care of them as they had gotten older. He was also an avid farmer, despite having studied to be a lawyer, and it was the care that he gave his aunts that led to him being selected as the next heir of the house. Charles was also a bit of a homebody. He was very committed to farming. He made some significant changes to the way that agriculture was done here at the estate. He made a change from the dairy farming that took place to more market gardening. This meant that he was producing more things like fruits and vegetables. He established orchards, and he was incorporating a lot of the scientific practices that were being developed at the Central Experimental Farm here on his own property. It also meant that he was subdividing the lots into smaller pieces so that more individuals could farm their own lands here at the estate. Either it was parceled off and sold to new owners, or it was leased and the land stayed in the family hands. Charles Murray was a bit unique as well in that he appreciated a solitary life. He didn't have any children himself and only married at the age of 59. So when it came time for him to pass along the house, he left it to his nephew, Charles Alexander. What we often find with this family is that there were a lot of individuals, but not a lot of distinction in the names. Charles Alexander had been a soldier in the First World War, and then he entered the mining industry. He moved his young family to Kenora, Ontario briefly, but he was able to retire when he was fairly young and brought them back here. One of his biggest accomplishments, or one of the biggest impacts that he had on the house, is that he was responsible for modernizing it. So the house was built in 1828, and he moved in the early 1940s. And when he moved in, there was still no electricity and no running water, despite the fact that these had been common in Ottawa for several decades at that point. Many of the rooms he did modernize, and when the city of Ottawa turned the house into a museum, we had to reverse some of the changes that he made to bring it into a more historic appearance. But he was looking to raise a modern family in the post-war era, and wanted some of the modern amenities. Charles Alexander did also sell the house to the city of Ottawa in 1975, around the time shortly before he passed away, because none of his children were interested in inheriting the house at that point, and they were keen on having the house preserved as a museum. So all told, the family did live here in this house for close to 150 years, and over the course of 5 generations. So Bradish and Lamira had 9 children who lived to adulthood, and they all went on and led their own interesting lives. As mentioned, Sally and Sabra inherited the house and used it as a dairy operation for much of their lives. But there were other children who made their own contributions to the community. Bradish Billings Jr., one of Bradish's younger sons, was not as keen as the farming operation, and he wasn't as keen as participating in the high society that his family had access to. And he ended up becoming an amateur botanist and entomologist. And so he actually spent much of his time wandering through the forests in the area and identified a number of species that had not been previously known in the region. One of his brothers, Elkanah, had a similar course. He studied law and practiced as a lawyer for a few years. He didn't enjoy it. He didn't enjoy the competitiveness of it, and so he made the move over to publishing, and was in fact an editor with an early version of the Ottawa Citizen for a number of years. But he was also an amateur naturalist, and he spent much of his time studying the rocks and the fossils in the area. And he was ultimately employed by the Geological Survey of Canada as their very first paleontologist. The Geological Survey of Canada still recognizes the contributions of Elkanah Billings with an annual Medal of Achievement. Charles Billings, the youngest son, stayed on the family property for many years. He continued to work as a farmer as well, but not as avidly as his sisters did. His greatest contributions to the family is that he was the family historian, and so a lot of what we know about the Billings family comes from records that they left behind, or that he came from records that Charles Billings produced. He wrote many diaries and even wrote a short family history, which we rely on for much of our research. When visitors arrive today, they are often met by what appears to be a fairly large and stately house. And when it was first built in 1825, that was definitely the impression that it gave, although it was a bit smaller than it is today. In 1828, the house was a very simple structure. It had a veranda stretching in front of it, and it didn't have the extensions that we see today and that are widely used today. The earliest image that we have of the house dates from the early 1830s, and it's a painting that one of Bradish and Lemira's daughters painted. And it does depict the house shortly after it was built with an addition on the right-hand side. That addition is now our lobby, and when it was first built, it was used as a summer kitchen. When Sally and Sabra inherited the house in the 1860s, they did divide it down the middle, which created some logistical problems because Sally was left without a kitchen. So the next addition was made in the 1860s when what we believe was an existing summer kitchen was added to the house. And today we still refer to it as Sally's Kitchen, though it does not maintain any of that original appearance. Over time, the veranda was eventually removed, additional garages were attached, and large dormers were added to the roof of the house. This allowed for more light to enter the house. It changed the appearance of the house quite a bit. And by the fifth generation, the children who were the last to grow up in this house, they lived in their bedrooms were in the attic. And so the dormers made it much more hospitable for them to be up there. When visiting the site, it's important to remember that at one point in time it stretched to approximately 1,500 acres from about Smythe Road all the way to Bronson Avenue, and from the Rideau River back to Alta Vista Drive. What's left today is about 8.5 acres, and in addition to the main house, there are a number of outbuildings. The gatehouse is the largest other structure. It was initially a single-story building that was used as a dairying for the dairying operation. So that's where much of the milk was separated to make butter and cheese and prepared to be distributed. A second floor was later added to that building, and it did serve as accommodations for some of the women who worked in the dairy. And today we use it as a programming space. You'll also find a couple of stone structures on the property, one of which is a smokehouse, which was a very functional building where the family could smoke meats in order to preserve them over the winter months, as well as an ice house, which was used as part of the dairying operation. It was a place where the ice could be stored, packed in sawdust, so that it would last right through the summer months. Eventually the family did get into the ice harvesting business as well. They really were quite entrepreneurial, and ice from the Rideau River was seen as being superior to ice that was harvested from the Ottawa River because there's less oxygen in the Rideau River, fewer bubbles, and so it was a denser ice that lasted longer. You know, more bubbles, more oxygen in the ice meant that it melted faster. The ice from the Rideau River would commonly last right through into the early fall. Also on the property is a cemetery, which with the earliest known burial dating back to 1820 or 1821. So it is considered to be one of the oldest cemeteries in what is now Ottawa. It was established for when the first member of the community died here. It was the mother of one of the men who worked for Bradish. And so the Billings set aside a parcel of land to be used as a burial ground, and it eventually expanded. Today there are estimated to be about 145 people who are buried there, although there are only a handful of grave markers. We don't have a clear sense of exactly where everyone is buried and who everyone is, as the records, not all of the records were maintained over the years. And at one point in time, the cemetery was kind of divided so that there is a settler cemetery and then the family cemetery. And there are about 16 members of the Billings family, starting with Bradish Billings, who are buried on the site here. The rest of the land was used by families who lived in the area. And there are some who continue to visit the cemetery to this day to pay their respects to their loved ones. Thanks very much for taking the time to watch our video today. We hope to see you one day at the museum, whether it's for a tour, a special event, or for a popular tea service.